work as a crucible of labor innovation. And at 1:30 is the panel on what the future of work debate means for labor studies. So if you're able to join those other two, we would love to have you there. This is just one of 3 pieces here. And I see some of the folks from tomorrow's panels are on today, so that's wonderful. All right, before we get started, introduce the speakers, I'm going to do the quick tech overview. First and foremost, if you're not speaking, please stay muted. I think everybody probably knows that by now. If this is your first time to Zoom, you can just scroll your cursor over the screen and you should see some buttons appear on the bottom for controls. The microphone mute is on the bottom left of the screen. And you can also click on the chat box and that'll open the chat on the side where some folks are introducing themselves now. Feel free to put your name and organization there if you would like. When we get to the question and answer section, we're going to ask folks either to put their name over, or their cursor over their name to raise their hand, or you can type stack in the chat, or you can just wave your hand wildly and I'll probably catch your, you'll catch my attention. And one final thing is a bit of a legal disclaimer. This session is being recorded. So that means everything is on the record. However, should you wish to say something that's off the record, you can indicate to me and I can pause the recording and then I can resume the recording when you're done. So just keep that in mind that this is on the record. And without further ado, we're going to get started. We're going to go ahead in the order that the names are listed in the program. So our first presentation is titled Towards Sectoral Bargaining for the Common Good. And our presenters are Joseph McCartin from Georgetown University and Marilyn Sneiderman from Rutgers. So I'll let you guys take it away.
Thanks, Todd. Oh, I'm looking for my presentation. Whoops. Todd, could you share it? Because I can't seem to share it. Would that be all right?
Todd was all ready.
Yep, no problem. I am prepared.
Sorry about that.
He knows me well enough.
Okay. Can you all see it now?
Great. Thanks, Todd. Yeah. All right. Can you hear me okay? Yeah.
Yep.
So I'll be quick. I'm going to share this with my colleague, Marilyn. So we want to talk about sectoral bargaining for the common good. And you can go to the next slide, Todd. So maybe some of you saw this article by Harold Meyerson last September. Marilyn and I were really struck by it. He talked about two emerging ideas that were really capturing people's imagination in the labor movement. Two ways of thinking about expanding bargaining. One was bargaining for the common good. The other was sectoral bargaining. And we thought it was really important that he cited those two things together. What we want to do today is talk about the need to bring those things together and to have sectoral bargaining informed by bargaining for the common good, which was something Harold didn't do. If you go to the next slide, Todd. So sectoral bargaining's gotten a huge amount of attention in the past year or two, only really from scholars. I think, first of all, Kate Andreas and her work has done a really great job at illuminating the promise of sectoral bargaining. At the recent Clean Slate report, which cited sectoral bargaining, David Madland and CAP have also talked about it. So sectoral bargaining is becoming increasingly an idea that people are focusing on. To the next. One measure of how popular it's becoming is just how many Democratic presidential candidates embraced sectoral bargaining in one way or another in the platforms they put forward. And here's a list of those that you could look at at more leisure later. Actually, I think it's a little disturbing that they found it so easy to embrace sectoral bargaining, because I think that points to one way that sectoral bargaining can go, which is to be a very surface level kind of reform in some ways. So if you go to the next slide, Todd. Most discussions of sectoral bargaining to date have really focused on what we can win under sectoral bargaining, I think, in very narrow terms. For example, consider what the Clean Slate Project says about it. They stress that it can help us take wages and working conditions out of competition for all firms in a sector. We believe, Marilyn and I and the folks we've been working with, that sectoral bargaining should go broader and deeper than that. That if we only win the ability to set wage standards with it, then we won't have won enough for workers in the current kind of economy that we're facing in the 21st century. We need to think in bigger terms. And if you go to the next slide, Todd. One of the ways that sectoral bargaining has been talked about recently is, and this I think comes up in a recent paper by Lynn Reinhardt, which she came up and published through EPI, is by looking at past ways that we did have multi-workplace bargaining in the US. There were national agreements like the Teamsters Master Freight Agreement, coordinated national bargaining, as happened at a place like GE, pattern bargaining in the auto industry, jobbers agreements in the needle trades. And in some ways, people are talking about sectoral bargaining as a way to recover some kinds of practices like these. But if you'd go to the next slide, Todd. One of the problems with thinking this way, I think, is that, yeah, right there. All of those methods of multi-workplace bargaining have really unraveled in recent years or decades. By changes in economic or public policy. Trucking deregulation really undermined the Teamsters Master Freight Agreement. Offshoring and outsourcing really destroyed the kind of bargaining that used to exist at GE. Pattern bargaining in the auto industry doesn't work that well anymore because the transplants aren't organized, and it's mostly become a defensive strategy. And jobbers agreements really have been destroyed by the transformation of the textile industry. If we're only thinking about trying to bargain in those kinds of ways, I think we're not going to be able to come to terms with some of the dynamic forces that are reshaping the economy in our time. And if you could go to the next slide, Todd. And I would cite two of those forces as financialization and growing monopoly. Now, if you look at the Clean Slate report or what CAP has written about sectoral bargaining, the term financialization doesn't appear in either of those reports, nor is there really a discussion of monopoly and how it's changing our economy. And so what we're concerned about is coming up with sectoral bargaining that gives us the tools to deal with these kinds of major forces. And now to the next slide. And we think bargaining for the common good helps us to think about what we need from sectoral bargaining. Bargaining for the common good is about changing how we think about bargaining by bringing new people to the bargaining table. On labor's side, the community is there. And on the employer's side, we try to bring in employer interests or interests beyond the employer that shape what the employer is able to do at the bargaining table. Bargaining for the common good was about dealing with financialization and monopoly, among other things. And it fights for workers holistically, as community members, as people who are raced and gendered, as tenants and homeowners, and in other ways. And it brings together their concerns at the bargaining table in a new kind of way. This is what we think we need to be thinking about when we're talking about sectoral bargaining. So now I'll turn it over to Marilyn.
Okay, next slide, Todd. Thanks, Joe. So what we thought would be helpful is to give a few really concrete examples of what bargaining for the common good looks like today. And I don't know how many remember this, but over just in this past year, first the LA teachers and staff went out on strike, and they had done such deep work with community organizations, with parents, with students, with immigrant rights groups, racial justice groups, that when people were out on strike, even when it was thunderstorming outside, it was the people felt like it was our strike, that everybody was together. So they managed to win. One of the things that the students had said to them over and over is that they hated the quote unquote random searches of their backpacks being pulled over. It was huge for the students, and they weren't winning on that by themselves. With the teachers, with this broader campaign, They won demands for green space, an end to these terrible random searches. They got librarians and nurses in the schools, smaller class sizes, just a whole bunch of things, even money for immigrant rights groups. So all through bargaining for the common good. And in Chicago, when the teachers again went out on strike, they centered both housing and racial justice in their demands. And I remember the mayor saying, "Why are you bringing up housing? That has nothing to do with the schools." And they responded saying 20,000 students at the very minimum are homeless in our school system. This is what we need to focus on. And most of those are brown and Black children. This has got to be central to everything we're doing. So these have been inspiring campaigns, and this movement is growing. Next slide. What sets apart the unions that are really focusing on bargaining for the common good, I believe, are going on offense, thinking bigger, that that's how we're going to build power. Unfortunately, many unions are feeling under a lot of stress and looking at narrowing their demands. And I would take it to the extreme right now in terms of the opposite. Is Harold just wrote another article this past week talking about police unions, and he called it bargaining against the common good. Next slide. I mean, I just want to lift that up. It's like at this point, I don't think that going narrower as trade unions and trying to protect the status quo will either protect our members or change our communities, and our members are part of their communities. So this is really, thank God for the uprising. So it's changing what's happening, and hopefully will dramatically change it. But I would say at the heart of sectoral bargaining, we've got to have an expansive vision that rejects narrow focused bargaining. Because the bottom line is, what good will it ultimately do for workers if no matter what we win to negotiate wage standards across the sector, if any wage gains, anything that workers get is wiped out by increased housing costs, or that neighborhoods are totally gentrified? You know, what will we really win by sector if the dominant corporate actors in that sector pass off any gains by workers as increased prices for consumers? Again, counterproductive. And lastly, for an example, is what will we really win by sector only if we see private equity firms take over and dismantle companies in that sector? These are just really challenging problems that we feel like, and Todd, the next slide, really lead to, you know, if we really are going to win the power we need to change our economy, that we absolutely need to do, then that means that we need to intersect sectoral bargaining with bargaining for the common good, is basically what we're talking about. What's exciting, next slide, what's exciting about this time is the leaders on the ground, both union leaders and community leaders that are really moving this work forward are now the BCG Advisory Committee. And they're strategizing with us, with each other, to try to move this work forward, make it bolder and bigger. And next slide. And I just feel really honored and privileged to be one of the 3 convening organizations that supports this growing bargaining for the common good network. And just want to encourage those of you on this call and part of this workshop is to join us, to come to the bargainingforthecommongood.org website, on any of our individual websites, or collectively, you'll see sample contract demands and all kinds of resources that unions are using throughout the country to really just become bolder and more powerful in the work that we're doing, which is what we need. Anyway, thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, Joe and Marilyn.
5 minutes.
Yeah, right. So we're going to keep it moving along and hold all the questions to the end till after all the speakers. So we'll move right into our second presentation, which is by Phela Townsend, and it's called "We Need a More Critical Analysis of Power." Phela? Oh, you have to unmute, I think. Or I got you.
I'm gonna have to, I'm gonna have some slides up and then I'm going to revert and stop sharing my screen.
Okay.
So yeah, I just wanted to share that I was going to originally talk a bit more about the nuts and bolts of my dissertation research, and then given some conversations in the last couple of days with my advisors, I actually switched gears and I decided to speak more to what I think is really at the heart of my research and what I'm interested in, which is really power. Actually, I'm not ready yet for these slides. Whoops, sorry. Sorry. Stop. Okay. Am I sharing the screen or?
Not yet.
Okay. Why am I acting like I'm not a millennial? Okay. So it seems that these days everyone wants to talk about power, especially during times of crisis when we see or experience the results of an inhumane and violent, unjust system. Yet, despite all the talking, it would appear that we are no closer to understanding power, at least in such a way that we've been able to translate it into real substantive outcomes, not just for some, but for all, or in a way that would rid our society of acts, of institutions, and of laws that will permit a cop to hold his knee down on the neck of a Black man until he's no longer able to breathe. So this then begs the question, at least for me, which is, do we really understand power? And if not, what's been getting in the way? Some, like Jane McAlevey, have suggested that it's because we spend too much time focusing on the power of the elites. Perhaps this is because this is the kind of power we yearn for or desire, not recognizing that the system is not designed to allow for this. Or perhaps we are the elites, and it's the lens through which we see the world. So I don't have a complete answer for today. I'd probably be getting paid a lot more and doing something else. But I do want to share some thoughts that I have on where I think we can go, both in theory and practice, with how we think about power.
Would you like me to share your presentation, Phela? Because I have it here.
Going to queue. Actually, if you can just share, that would be great. And then I can just focus on my notes.
Okay, and then you just let me know when to go for it.
So again, this question, why do we need a critical analysis of power in the theory and practice? So next slide, or slide 4. And I'm gonna go through, I'm not gonna spend a lot of time on literature review, just because I wanna get to the heart of some other things, but, and Janice knows this because she and I have been doing a lot of reading on power, but if we look at literature broadly on power, some, like Marissa, have argued it's underdeveloped and under-theorized. We indirectly talk about power, but we don't really critically analyze it. Even when we look in the industrial relations literature, you can go to the next slide, or actually that's not the next slide, but this whole notion of power being in the eye of the beholder, I think is really important and critical. So I just threw up 3 definitions of it, and these all perhaps maybe conjure different ideas, right? Next slide. If we do go into the literature, we see different definitions or language used to express similar ideas or forms of power. And in some ways, there are blurred lines. You can go to the next slide. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. But in our field specifically, sure, like a core assumption is this notion of an imbalance of power between capital and labor, management and workers. Struggle tends to be seen as class-based, although I think there's a push more to changing that. Or power was, typically understood as bargaining power. And this makes sense if you think about the foundations. But I think we can go further, which I'll get to, or we should go further or need to. So the next slide is really just, I'm not going to spend a lot of time. It's not an exhaustive list. I didn't even really cite them, although if someone does want cites on this, I can provide them. But these are just different ways power is being talked about and understood. The next slide, and there are questions. Are we talking about a source or a dimension or mechanism? Are we talking about individual, collective? Like, what are we really talking about? And I think people are talking about different things. Next slide. These are some works in just the last 2 decades that have looked at power. And there are different conceptualizations. In some ways, folks built on previous work. And And to me, one of the things that comes from this is over time, the next slide, we start to see there's this more expanded yet nuanced and dynamic view of power, which takes into account this idea that exercising or building, and I'll say worker power, because these were all works looking at worker activism and labor organizations. It's not the same for every person, organizing group, or context. To me, this is what I took from these. And I think this is important, but I think we need to go farther. And so what do I mean by this? What do I mean by more critical theory or analysis of power? I think part of why power has been so difficult to theorize and study is because it's a shapeshifter, right? It morphs and changes form based on context, structures, and over time. The idea that power is dimensional and evolving, takes on new forms, isn't really new. Foucault believed that power doesn't always assume just one form, and that in light of this, a given form of power can actually maybe exist, coexist alongside, or even come into conflict with other forms of power. Critical theorists have argued that political theory has failed to develop analytic tools appropriate to study new forms of power and modify practices of old forms of power. And I would extend this to our field and related fields that look at workers. So let's take economic power, for example. So Nancy Fraser has argued that in her book, Capitalism, A Conversation in Critical Theory, that Marxism requires a total analysis of capitalism that acknowledges the totality of the system that we live in and under, beyond a narrowly economistic view. That throughout history, capitalism has been defined not just by labor exploitation, but also by the disavowal of the exploitation's own basic conditions of possibility. She writes, quote, the economistic insistence of sharp divisions, such as those drawn between the economic and political and environmental, between the workplace and the home, or between liberal free labor regimes in wealthy countries, raw expropriation on the neo-colonial periphery, are themselves key to the legitimation and reproduction of the capitalist order. In other words, capitalism's survival depends on us not being able to understand it in its totality. Our class-based or economic assumptions and models don't resonate with our understanding and view of the world, today at least, but I would argue perhaps always. The proletariat is not made up of different groups. Some groups have more perceived or real privilege and power within the proletariat. Not everyone who's in the proletariat has the same position or standing, and they don't necessarily have the same consciousness, and thus they do not perceive struggle in the same way. And while there, of course, and will be similar or common points of struggle and solidarity among them, they don't necessarily endeavor or dream to resist in the same way. In Black Marxism, a critique of Western Marxist tradition, Cedric Robinson argues that the notion of the universal class struggle was a major weakness of Western Marxism. Although there were minimal references to slavery, some have argued that Marx was likely aware of the transatlantic slave trade and chattel slavery in the US. He ignored race as a means of explaining historical struggles in capitalism. So in this counter narrative of the story of capitalism, Cedric Robinson makes several points that I think are really critical for how we understand power broadly, how we understand economic power, how we understand legal or regulatory power, how we understand state power. So one, he said, race and gender are not accidental features of global capitalism. Rather, capitalism emerged and evolved as a racialized and gendered regime. He argued that race and gender are not about identity. They are social constructs and means of structuring power through difference. Skin color, for example, is not an essential feature of racism, although a common one. And then he said the role of race in the making of the global capitalist order was really about the propensity of capital, the ruling wealthy elite and the state, to capture the white working class and tie its identity to the race that is white masculine identity. Therefore, the original sin of capitalism was not to homogenize, but to differentiate, to exaggerate regional, subcultural, and dialectical differences into racial ones, ultimately to shape the process of proletarianization and the formation of working class consciousness. One final point I just want to make about how critical theory talks about race specifically, but I think this also relates to how we understand power and this shape-shifting idea. In Racecraft, Barbara Fields and Karen Fields discuss how and why a handful of racist notions have gained permanent subsistence in American life, They argue that rituals and everyday practices, such as in science and medicine, play a crucial role in shaping, reproducing, and reconstituting the falsehoods, social myths, languages, and symbols necessary to reinforce the existing ideologies and norms that entrench the institutional, social structures and relationships over time and space. At the same time, though, ironically, despite these powerful effects, these rituals embody a fragility rooted in superstition and irrationality. Therefore, they must be constantly tended to, cultivated, and reified in life spheres that transcend the political and economic so that they can stay alive and persist. So I know I'm going into my 11th minute, but what I say about all of this is part of why it's critically important to revisit our notions of power is really because, as I'm trying to argue, power not only has changes and evolves over time and takes on different forms, but it's possible that there are multidimensional aspects of it. And so if we look narrowly as economic power, as class power, we miss a whole bunch of what's going on. We miss and fail to understand the true nature of economic or regulatory or other types of power. And we say, for example, that Jim Crow has ended because laws were passed. But in reality, it never really ended. Rather, it just evolved and operated into more insidious and invisible ways. Or why even as chattel slavery became illegal, mass incarceration of primarily Black and brown people in the prison industrial complex, voter suppression, racialized policing and surveillance, right? These are all ways that power has just evolved and it's taken on different forms. It's why women and people of color can be corporate executives and politicians, and the gender and racial wage gaps still persist. So I know my time is short here. I did have a piece where I wanted to talk about how I think this all plays into forms of worker organization. So hopefully I'll be able to get a chance to talk about that in the question session.
All right, thank you, Phela. So moving right along to our final presentation, then we can get to the questions and hopefully we can get back to that that point you wanted to make in your conclusion. We're going to move to Joel Yudken of High Road Strategies and David Jacobs from Morgan State University for their paper entitled Worker Voice and Technological Change, Challenges and Opportunities. Joel and David, take it away.
Sorry about that. I wasn't unmuted. Okay. Thanks a lot. Can you see my presentation, my slideshow?
Yep, we can see it and we can hear you now.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate being here and also sharing this panel, this virtual podium with my colleagues. And let me just also say, I'm going to be giving the presentation and then David Jake was my collaborator on this from Morgan State will be available for questions after as will I. I just wanted to first play off of the two other presentations. One is that technology, you know, our topic is about worker voice in technology change. So first, technology, if anything, is all about power. And that's one of the big focuses we want to bring to this discussion. And the second is also about the common good, or the fact is that we're not using technology in a way that really is optimizing for the common good. In fact, quite the opposite. So anyway, let me see how I move this. Okay. Let me see how do I do this? I'm going to do presentation. Yeah. So, as I say, our primary purpose here is to examine the roles that worker voice can play in shaping the implementation of technology possibilities, not only across workplaces, but in industrial systems and even in society itself. Let me just start here by talking about a project that I'm actually involved in right now, working with a southern utility and a bargaining unit of close to about 3,000 employees, where the company is trying to actually find a way to cut about 10% of the workforce. And so I've been engaged with this project for several months now. We're working with a major union representing them, and in the process of my discussion, interviewing of a lot of their members, what I came across, among other things, were a lot of complaints that they were dealing and they were using a lot of new technologies that were database technologies and other smart tech machines and technologies that were being applied into their workplace for various kinds of activities like inventory and purchasing, field operations, consumer services, human resource management. And they were complaining about a lot of the problems they had about them, and the feeling that in fact, they were feeling that the way they've been implemented, the management, they were not as good as the manual systems. But the real problem was that they were feeling that, I asked them, I says, to what extent did they come to talk to you or the unions when they were trying to design and implement these systems? And basically not at all. And there was only a modicum of training that went along with this. So these folks were very frustrated, both in terms of what was going on in their jobs. They were a lot of dissatisfaction, as well as, in addition, they also recognized there was a lot of diminished quality of services and productivity for the company. So I saw this as an example of a lot of what we actually see today still, even though there's been a lot of movement more positively in terms of some management policies and more engagement of workers, and we'll come to that. But it's basically a leave your brains at the door mentality that has basically pretty much characterized a lot of activity, a lot of different jobs and businesses and how they operate. And of course, the root of this, we are, and I want to just start focusing on that, is basically the dismantling of craft production as a result of the Industrial Revolution, the introduction of the factory system, mechanization and automation, the detailed division of labor. Then in the 20th century, the introduction of Taylorism and Fordism, in which the whole purpose was to dissociate the labor process from worker skills, the separation of conception and execution, and the management taking monopoly control over all knowledge and the steps of production in their production system and in the workplace. And as Robert Conigal writes in The One Best Way, and this is a biography of Frederick Taylor, after Ford and Taylor got through with them, most jobs need less of everything: less brains, less muscle, and less independent. Okay, so that's sort of our starting point on this, to look at how we understand technological change and its relationship to the workplace, and how, of course, it's evolved from a place, this craft paradigm, which we recognize as one is, it's an idealized form. But we know that craft production did not exist in a vacuum. It was in an historical context. There was a lot of other forms of oppression and class structure and so on. But basically, it represents kind of a more idealized form where workers really did have a certain degree of control over their workplace and production, and they operated within communities where they had their power gave them a lot of control over what was happening in their own communities as well. But a lot of bargaining power too. And that was, so anyway, where we want to go from here is to recognize also that when we talk about technology, we're not talking about some kind of autonomous exogenous force, but something which is socially constructed, something that is basically a result of human agency and authority that has guided the direction and the extent of technology change in human activities. But as we know, as applied through history, was this agency and authority is the way it's given direction to technology. There's, of course, been winners and losers. And of course, there's the famous golden rule: those that have the gold, of course, make the rules. And so where we wanted to go with this is that we wanted to reinforce the importance of the understanding of human agency and authority in influencing the direction, because although that's the history and basically is what we're continue to be up against, we also don't have to accept this as given. It's not, technology is not inevitable. And it is not destiny, as this Aspen quote that I have, and we mentioned in the beginning, from a conference they had on the future of work. Now, now we're focusing, and we're still exploring the different examples of this, but there's a lot of different ways that labor, of course, we're very aware of this and has tried to respond to this. This is more in the modern era, the responses to automation and the digital age. Now, this wasn't digitization, but a very powerful form of technology change. The ILWU and their agreement with the ship owners, this was a controversial thing led by Harry Bridgers. They saw a loss of many of their workers, but they did maintain a lot of control over their workplace and their job and their bargaining power within at least at that time, within the whole shipping industry. The other example is of A. Philip Randolph and his March in Washington, something I only learned about recently. He started talking about how we should govern technology's design and use, because they were concerned about the impacts of automation on Black workers in his industry. And as in the porters and in the International Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. So, and then there's a whole lot of other examples that I've left out here: the UAW, the Lordstown strike, the rise and fall of the Saturn experiment. But the Machinists Union, who I've used to work very closely with in the past, they, in the 1980s, as all part of what began, was also an industrial policy initiative by labor, had this, what they call the Technology Bill of Rights, where they outline a whole lot of different type of things that they feel that labor and we should be fighting for around technology change. Now, more recently, but actually growing out of that period, the Industrial Union Department had conferences on technology policy. Some of you may have been involved or remember this, and which focused both on policy as well as the impacts in the workplace. And they came out with was a famous study at the time, or report called Software and Hard Hats, Technologies and Workers in the 21st Centuries. And more recently, the AFL-CIO Commission on the Future of Work and Unions. That's a very recent activity, in which I'm very pleased to see, where Trumka has now brought together experts in industry, labor leaders, and so on to really start to explore what does all this new age technology mean for us in future and bargaining and so on. So I'm going to continue because I have so little time on this. So let's come back to that. If you distill all this, we start to see that a number of the goals and issues that we think stand out, that when we're facing technology change, are from job security to sharing the gains, what's happening in the workplace to make around issues of useful work, satisfying work, and so on, health and safety, protections for privacy, and also equity, inclusion, and sharing those gains, and finally reestablishing a degree of ownership of work. And but when you look at this, and we realize, and we're calling recrafting, this is basically the elements of craft in this idealized form. So that's why we're giving it this term recrafting, because we're talking about how do we recraft the workplace? How do we craft the nature of work and production, and bringing back a lot of the values and goals, and they give workers really a genuine say in the, and especially as we're facing new generations of technology. So the two things that we're looking at first is more generally, so what are the levers and drivers to enable us to make these changes? Where do we really have to really fight? What can we use? What are the sources of influence and power? And we talk about collective bargaining, of course, strengthening unions and worker representation. We're going to have to fight legally and in political battles, as well as promote various forms of legislation to promote this. Another thing is to involve workers directly in the science and technology institutional government. something that I've personally been involved in, and I know that's where, in fact, back in the 90s, I was representing the Industrial Union Department at the Manufacturing Extension Partnership, something that the AFL and the IAD pushed that was under Clinton, that we should have labor people there. We have done that for other agencies like the Labor Department, but moving us more into the realm of technology and being at the front end rather than just at the back end of technology change. Promoting, there's various efforts, and some of this has been tied into collective bargaining, participation in the technology process and design, education, labor management partnerships, and management initiative measures. These are some of the things we started to look at as the levers, but then finally we've started to identify a range of activities. These aren't just the levers, there are a number of activities that have been going on, efforts and initiatives in each of these areas to give workers a voice, and as a right, strengthening the bargaining, the sectoral bargaining, technology bargaining, the use of digital tools for organizing, and going back to the union, the Machinist Technology Bill of Rights, seat at the table from high performance work organizations, employee involvement, workers' councils, and so on. So we try to identify a range of different kind of mechanisms to give workers and worker organizations a real seat at the table so they can start shaping technology change at the front end rather than the back end. Different strategies and going on for like skill-based automation and cobots. We have examples of that, of improving the quality of work, and also looking some of the foreign examples where some of that is really taken very seriously and being done in German, Italian, Swedish, Japanese, and Spanish models. And then of course the sharing of the gains. And finally, just transition, that we recognize technology, workers will be, no matter what we do, as what happened in containerization, there's going to be a large number of workers that will find themselves faced with transition. We have a very poor transition. We do have transition mechanism in this country. They're not as good as internationally, like in Germany, for example, and the Scandinavian countries. We don't have the kinds of safety nets. So we need to beef that up. And these kinds of TA, like what this colleague of mine at the Century Foundation talking about it like a TAA, for technological change. So in this case, we want to broaden this, and now this is the same kind of problems we may face for transition when we're talking about transition from fossil fuel type industries to renewables, for example, which is itself a technological change. Okay, so finally, we are, what we want to do, and we're going to continue exploring this over the summer. What are the collective bargaining, public policy, and other actions that we need to transform the authority-based systems that are governing technology change in workplaces and society. We're going to look at the experimentation with new forms of organizing and representation. And we want to explore this and take all this and see if we could start at least laying out in a broad sense, a coordinated strategic direction. Anyway, on that note, I will end. Did I go over? I probably did.
Just a little bit.
Okay.
Thank you, Joel, and David for your contribution here on this. If you could stop sharing your screen, I will transfer the microphone over to Marissa Brookes from the University of California, Riverside, who was kind enough to join us as a discussant for all these papers and will offer some feedback and insight. Marissa?
Hi, everyone. So I'm going to keep it brief. Hopefully we have time for questions and answers. And my discussant comments are not going to focus on the papers individually. Instead, I'd like to try to tie everything together to the extent that I think that's possible. So as you remember, we had a presentation about sectoral bargaining for the common good. We talked about concepts and theories of power, and we just had a presentation on worker voice in technological change. And I really think Phela's paper helps unify the theme of this panel, which is about how do workers get these types of power and where does power come from, right? And you can understand power very abstractly as the ability of A, often workers, to get B, could be employers or government actors, to do something B otherwise wouldn't do. So when we're thinking about something like sectoral bargaining or more worker control over technology adoption or changing collective bargaining so that it impacts the common good and not just a narrow set of interests, we can think about how does history inform how workers in other contexts, whether it's the US in the past or in a comparative context in other countries, what does history tell us about when workers were able to obtain these types of power? Because I think that's really the central question that brings this together. Phela, my fellow millennial, is asking, well, what is power in general? And I think the other two papers are saying, look, we'd like to change what collective bargaining looks like. We'd like to see what it would look like if workers had some say over technology that's implemented in the workplace. What they're really talking about is a sort of consolidated version of power, an institutionalized position that gives workers a say. And historically, we know that, say, in a lot of countries of Western Europe, where we look at, say, the German system, they have the rights to consultation and information on matters of employee concern. They have works councils. They have a legal right to sit on the board of directors of corporations. That is deeply entrenched in these historical legacies that some of which can be traced back to medieval guild systems, can be traced back to Depression era and post-war social pacts, right? So I would say one way, if we're going to try to actually get these things into motion, is to study institutions, where they come from historically, and when are these moments where they can change. And there are sort of two main ways, at least political scientists have been thinking about this for quite a while. One is there's a critical juncture, right? A big opening in which there is an opportunity for change. So if someone were to say defund the police and make that their platform 10 years ago, it might not have as much traction as it would today because we have this massive critical juncture with large and growing social movements across the US and the world. So, critical junctures is one thing. But another way that we've thought of how do you change collective bargaining institutions? How do you change the laws and rules and regulations? Institutional scholars have been theorizing at least three other ways that change comes. One is layering, one is conversion, one is drift. So layering is when you put up a new set of rules, right? You want green energy and shift away from fossil fuels, just make that exist. And the old system will eventually die out. It's like laying out a different pipeline and feeding that one and letting the other one starve out. Or when you see private healthcare systems layered over a public system, unfortunately, the public system eventually gets neglected, stops getting funding, and the private system prevails, right? So layering is one way that this has happened. Just do the new thing and wait for the old thing to expire because the new thing's getting more traction. Conversion is another way historically we've seen existing institutions change. And I don't have an industrial relations example, but a lot of us in this room can think about, the US Constitution. It was made for one purpose and then reinterpreted to be not just representative of the interests of white property owning rich men, right? So you can convert existing institutions into something new. And then there's drift, where you sort of do just let something expire out of neglect. But if we think about power as not just what workers do, right? Not just actions like strikes, like structural power, withdrawing your labor, but eventually power gets consolidated over time into these laws, rules, and regulations, in part because the actors against whom they're exercising power realize that they've met their match. And so these things become institutionalized over time. So again, if we're thinking about, well, how do we in the United States get sectoral bargaining for the common good? Or how do we in the United States or maybe around the world get workers to have a seat where they are equal with management in making a decision about technology? We have to study history. How did this work before? What worked and what didn't work? How did other countries that have this actually obtain that? And I think that's the way we move forward. And then I was thinking as well about who are the actors in these three papers. And I noticed that in discussions of workers' power, we're often only talking about the workers. But again, what history teaches us and what the study of institutions teaches us is that you usually get change, not only when there's a critical juncture or these different types of other gradual change, but when you see new coalitions forming, right? When actors who were previously neutral or maybe even opposed to labor join up with labor, and these sort of uncommon bedfellows or maybe just very logical bedfellows come together, and these new coalitions push for change. And so, for example, in the presentation on technology and getting a seat at the table, maybe there is a bargaining for the common good theme that could come in here, right? It's not just about workers wanting a say over the implementation and adoption of new technologies that might make them redundant or might de-skill them or make their work less valuable to them. But what are the broader community concerns, right? Link up with broader community concerns. And just as with the link with sectoral bargaining, a lot of great examples in that first presentation of making demands in collective bargaining that have less to do with what are perceived as labor's narrow interests and more to do with what are seen as broader community interests. So two more quick points for, I guess, everybody on the panel. One is that think about what power is. I think Phela's presentation really drives that home. And think about power as relational. I didn't see a lot in these papers about who's actor B. If A is acting on B, right, you can't think of power as a thing or a resource that workers hold. It only makes sense in relation to the other actor. So what are the interests and strategies of the employers involved, of the government actors involved? I saw a lot of theorizing about what are the interests of workers, what are their strategies, what are their goals? What about the actors with whom they are in conflict? And it doesn't have to be conflict, it could be compromise. But we don't see a lot of theorizing about the interests and strategies of employers, of government actors, of these other community partners that could be labor's allies and often are. So more theorizing on that, I think, would be great for all three presenters. And then there's sort of this question I'll leave you with, which is, do you need power to get power? And what I mean by that is, again, if you have a goal like having workers sit on the board of directors, having workers have more say over technology implementation in the workplace, or these bargaining for the common good type goals, where does that power originally come from to have that kind of influence? Because ultimately, even if something is institutionalized in law, in regulations, in social norms, ultimately that is backed up by sort of the threat of disruption. Right? The threat of disruption to production, the threat of disruption by marching out in the streets, the threat of disruption through your purchasing power, through your voting power to elect someone new. But all of those types of power have a history and were consolidated because of past struggles, right? So ultimately, turtles all the way down, what you get to is a point in history where there was open conflict, right? So kind of, you know, again, power is relational. Who's actor B? Do you need power to get power, right? If you're drawing on the influence of community allies and your labor and you're trying to meet some goal, where did their power come from, right? Like kind of theorize, where does that come from? And, you know, finally, again, history. What can we learn from history in order to pursue these goals? Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you, Marissa. That was terrific. So we do have a couple questions that have popped up in the chat already. We have two requests for Phela to have the opportunity to make her final remarks that she didn't get the time to do. So Phela, I would like to open up that space for you now if you would like to take a moment.
Yeah, no, thank you for those. I think I just wanted to bring this more concretely back to thinking about worker organization, and it is what my dissertation research looks at. I mean, and it's really this idea, and just taking some of the things that Marissa said, understanding how power operates, how it changes, or whatever have you, how it operates. I don't think we can effectively build worker power if we don't get that, right? So like, it sounds like it's a bit of what Marilyn and Joe are saying in their piece of why the way sectoral bargaining is being talked about and why they think it's problematic, in the sense that, like, to me, right, like what we know, what we can see about power is it's given rise to this concentration to, well, things are systemic either way, but the point is that the bargaining strategy and the work, right, has to follow the form of power. Why I think we're seeing this emergence of all of these different types of worker organizations, as I said, coalitional formations, right, is because of this concentration of wealth and power and how we see it, right? It's why we have to do that to go after Amazon, right? Why FINA has emerged, or to go after Walmart. institutional investors are, and I've seen, you know, Bargaining for the Common Good folks have talked about this, right? Once you understand that the concentration of wealth sits in the hands of these like 5 or 6 people who basically operate and run Wall Street and affects communities across issue, right? Then that informs your bargaining strategy, or it should. Arcelin and Rogers has this really interesting report that was done in 2018 for anyone who's interested in digital technology use, which is also part of my dissertation, where they talk about how there's this lack of agreement on sorts of power and the strategy. And I think part of what I want to say, where I think there needs to be an intervention, and again, I don't have all the answers, but my sense is that there's a disconnect in different parts of not just the labor movement, but I hear it from policymakers and politicians about this idea where we have to be moving towards some consensus on this form of worker power and worker organization. And I think from our analyses of power and the varied form that it takes on, it doesn't, to me, it doesn't make sense. I don't know if others can speak to that. Janice, I see you on here, but like those who are doing intersectional movement work, right? Bargaining for the common good work, to me, and I may be preaching to the choir, but I see this debate happening in so many seats of power in DC and other places where I think that's a lot of why we can't build the kind of worker power that we need to build.
Thank you, Phela. So we have Tammy Lee is next on stack with a question. Tammy?
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yep.
So I do have a question, and I think it's for all 3 folks or 3 presentations. It's sort of based in this question between Marissa, or the conversation between Marissa and Phela on power. Marissa asks, you know, do you need power to get power? Phela challenges us to have a more critical understanding of power. The Bargaining for the Common Good folks are looking very innovative about how to redistribute power as we've conventionally looked at it. And I wonder, you know, in the events of the last couple of weeks, you know, the AFL-CIO's headquarters in DC were targeted by protesters, right? And there was a viral video to the tech people that was going around, and some of the protesters answered a question about why they targeted the AFL-CIO. Some of the things they said were that unions are racist and use Black workers to protect white bodies, and even though they're pro-union, they hate the racism within unions. Some people said unions historically fail to protect Black workers. Some said unions protect bad police. And so I guess I'm saying all this when I look at these moments and all of this exciting work that bargaining for the common good, and even the term bargaining for the common good means, I wonder if the problem isn't just an under-theorization of power, but some pretty heavy presumptions about what workers want and who are the workers that we're considering when we decide what workers want, right? So for Black workers, I'll go with that first, because the tech folks gave a presentation and they talked about A. Philip Randolph and it being like a new thing that they found. What the thing is that maybe we are under-theorized on what certain types of workers want because we're so used to thinking of unions and class solidarity, like a very flat, singular class solidarity. What if it is that workers want justice? And who has the power to define justice, right? So one way then to explain bargaining for the common good and its successes and this approach of whole worker organizing is that when you do that, it is inherently intersectional and it centers the things that the most marginalized workers want, right? Which might be something different than wages, hours, and working conditions as a salient concern, right? So this ability to grow coalitions at this critical juncture, don't we maybe need to understand what workers want and have a broader definition of both workers and about solidarity.
Can I just quickly say, I think you're absolutely right. Part of the work, what I'm trying to do in my dissertation is to use some case studies to kind of look at this. Because I think that, and what I want to try to do is understand the theories of power that are guiding these organizations that I'm looking at. So just to be very blunt, right, there are folks here on the call that are aware of the National Black Worker Center. What the leadership in that organization is thinking about in response to the last few months and weeks is perhaps going to be different than what leaders of another organization that maybe aren't just Black workers are going to be thinking about. And I think that's part of the point I'm trying to make is that, and I know I've been focusing on this understanding of power, but I think it does go to this idea that certain needs just aren't being met by the traditional, what we think of as the traditional labor movement. I think people just forget also that, I mean, the reality is for example, New Deal era legislation that we got, right, and that the AFL-CIO at the time really endorsed and pushed was really about leaving a bunch of Black and brown and immigrant workers out of that deal, right? So there's an inherently racist undertone to the origins of the labor movement in that sense, or that at least that era of it. And so to me, when I talk about understanding power and revisiting notions of it and how we understand it, right, where unions are seen as this, you know, this class, like or at least the study and the research of it, it tends to be narrowly thought of it from a class or economic perspective, and we miss the racial, the gender, these other components that to me are part of economic power, because my point about it all being about the totality of capitalism, we miss and we can't understand why, as we try to build a labor movement today, why some folks just aren't about unions, or some forms of organization just aren't resonating with certain groups. So I think that's sort of connecting the point that I'm trying to make.
I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap it up at that point. I feel like we're just at the tip of the iceberg of what could be a really great conversation that could go right into the evening and throughout the rest of the week. And it should carry on offline, because it's an important conversation that we all need to be having. But I would like to thank all of the panelists for taking the time to join us. And I apologize that we only had 1 hour. This format is very difficult to get into the weeds. But we do value the nuggets that you were able to share with us today. And I also want to thank all the participants for also joining in the conference virtually. As you can see, I showed up in Portland. I don't know where you guys are. It was empty when I got here in the conference room. See all the empty chairs? Yeah. So yes, thank you again for joining. And I hope that you all stay healthy and stay safe, and finding meaningful ways to contribute to the struggle each day safely. Be well.
Ouch.